We have reached the grand final of the Magnus Carlsen chess tour. Magnus Carlsen himself faces Hikaru Nakamura. It's an old rivalry, and this promises to be a superb contest. Game 1 was drawn, and I'm going to show you Game 2. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting us via PayPal or Patreon. So here we go, Carlsen with the white pieces, and he's playing an orthodox opening, and Nakamura plants his pawn in the middle of the board. Now here black has a big choice. In the past we've seen Nakamura play bishop e7 and the Queen's Gambit decline against Carlsen, but today he took on c4. Now Hikaru plays a whole range of openings, and he's very well prepared, and I think the fact that he had an extra day to prepare might have helped him, because of course he blanked Dubov, completely wiped him out in the semi-final, whereas Carlsen took a little bit longer to defeat Ding Liren. So we go in for this variation, and now of course bishop b4 is possible, but b5 is a really interesting move that's come to the fore over the past few years, maybe the past 5 years. So if knight takes pawn, you can take the pawn on e4. Therefore white plays e5, knight comes to d5, and only then knight takes b5. So white has this very nice pawn on e5, which gives a lot of space. But then again, this knight comes back to b6 to protect that pawn. So material is still even. Black has these double pawns, but it doesn't matter so much. Black can hold on to that pawn on c4. But already we've got an unbalanced position. Now you might recall a fantastic game that Ding Liren played. He played bishop e2 and defeated Duda in the Olympiad in 2018. Do check out that game. It's on the channel. Maybe I'll post the link to it later. It's just a brilliant game by the Chinese player. So bishop e2 is the absolutely normal move here. But Carlsen played a3. To my knowledge, that hasn't been played before. Could be useful to prevent that knight hopping into b4 and back into d5. Knight c6 played and bishop e3. So bishop comes out, supports the pawn, but also it's about getting that queen's rook into play quickly. So knight a5 from Nakamura, and that immediately looks at the square on b3 and exploits a slight drawback with the pawn coming to a3. Also, that knight on a5 does lend extra support to the pawn on c4, and that's important because it stops the bishop arriving on this dream diagonal. When there's a pawn on e5, that's a beautiful piece. Queen c2 played by Carlsen. The knight's attacked by the pawn, so knight c3. Bishop e7, and now rook d1. So you can see that was the idea behind bishop e3, gets the rook into a really active position. And although it doesn't look like it's doing much at the moment, we'll see a moment later on where this is really significant that the rook is on d1. Bishop e7. Good square for the bishop, of course, slicing down the diagonal. Bishop e2 and queen d7. So if white castles on the king side, the problem is how exactly do you get kingside play here? With the pawn on e5, normally that gives white a space advantage. Normally, you can use this diagonal to attack on the king side, but here, because of that pawn, it's not easy. Ideally you would like to bring that queen over to the king side, but very difficult in this position. So how exactly do you do this? Well, Carlsen has an idea. He played h4. Good move. And that is going to allow this rook into the game. Bishop c6 played, and interesting from Nakamura, so he's looking to get some play by moving the bishop here. Rook h3, and it's using the space advantage which white has on the king side. But of course, it's risky. The king has to remain in the middle. Rook b8, excellent from Nakamura. That rook is directed at that pawn on b2. So I find it really interesting that both players are kind of ignoring each other and just continuing with their own plans. And this is so typical for the chess that's being played, I think, well, really by the top players in all these rapid play events, actually. It's all about focusing on the initiative, don't blink, don't back down. And Carlsen continues with his plan on the king side, rook g3. Now here's a fascinating moment. Nakamura continues with his policy of play on the queen side with bishop a4. If he'd slowed down and defended against the threat of rook g7, just look what happens. Now, white has various options here, but I wonder whether Carlsen was considering this move, d5. Now, if this is taken with, well, let's say bishop, then you could just take here, play the bishop back here, attack this, and then you can take here. Looks reasonable for white. Or if knight takes, again the bishop drops back and targets the knight here, and maybe that knight will come into e4. This one is under fire. Okay, so the real test of d5 is what happens on pawn takes pawn. Well, then an extraordinary move, e6. So basically white is just clearing the way for this knight to hop into one of these squares. So if queen e6, knight, you take on b6 and then knight d4, you take on c6, you take on d5. Basically white gets fantastic play. And here's another alternative. After e6, if pawn takes pawn, rook g6 is an amazing move. Looking to get the queen in to g6, knight on e5. I mean, it's an amazing attack. So I don't know whether this is intuition from Hikaru, but he was absolutely right not to play g6. I think white would have had just a superb initiative. Bishop a4, so he continues on. So obviously queen attacked, rook attacked, so knight takes bishop, queen takes. You can see black is targeting that pawn. So Carlsen just plays the rook across, so at least the rook would defend that pawn on b2. Knight b3 attacks the rook, and once again we see one of the players just continuing straight on. Now Carlsen didn't bother moving this rook, which would have slowed things down. Instead, he just took with the rook on g7 and gave up the exchange. Knight takes rook, queen c1. So he's broken through on the king side, shattered those pawns. Now if he could join in with the bishop and perhaps get the queen in, it could be very dangerous. So, well, Nakamura doesn't bother defending on the king side. He recognises that he needs to keep his initiative going. I really find this a fascinating struggle between the players, both playing great chess. Now if pawn takes, then the knight comes into d5, and you can see the b file opens. Bishop a3 is possible, that pawn on c3 is vulnerable, and that king is still in the middle. Can't castle, of course, it needs the rook. So queen takes played by Carlsen. Knight d5 attacks the queen comes back. Knight takes bishop. So, well, we'll see why this is played in a second. Pawn takes, so the queen's still hanging on to that b pawn. And now king f8. So you can see without that bishop, the bishop can't come to h6, it's no longer on the board. And the king is able to drive away that rook. Queen b3 attacks the pawn on b2, and Carlsen takes on c7. Queen takes b2, and here Carlsen, I think, well, I would guess instinctively just put the king on a safe square on f2, so that it's well protected by the bishop and the pawn, and covers that e3 pawn as well. In fact, he had quite a strong move here, d5. Once again with the idea of giving up pawns to open up the position, and that actually gives white a blistering attack with bishop h5 check. Now, black can defend with queen b7, but that protected passed pawn on d6 is pretty strong, and you can see, well, black's rooks are split, not very good. Black's just so poorly coordinated. That looks very strong for white, actually, even though he's the exchange down. So d5 looks like a good shot, but, well, Carlsen played this very natural move, king f2, queen b7, and now, well, Carlsen has to sort of fall back. And I think Nakamura is actually okay here. Good defense from him. Queen d3 threatens queen h7. Rook g7 prevents that. And now Carlsen simply decides to take that pawn on a6, and they reach an endgame. Check. Bishop comes back to protect the king, and bishop takes pawn. So you can see black has two rooks and a bishop against a rook, knight and bishop. Carlsen has two extra pawns, so it's knight and two pawns against a rook. So a rough material balance. And I think this position is about equal. Those rooks are still split. That's a slight problem for black. But it's difficult for white to use these extra pawns somehow. I think a good idea for white now is to put that knight on d3 and shuffle the king up the board, maybe play g3, keep that very solid position but reroute that knight. But Carlsen played g4, and this move looks a bit odd to me because it really restricts the rook. Nakamura brought the bishop back to e7, good move, looking at h4, but also just preventing g5 for the moment, so it covers some squares. Now rook e4 from Carlsen, I think that's kind of an indication that in fact he's not quite sure what to do here. It's interesting, he didn't manage his time as well as Hikaru, who was playing very confidently, very quickly, had a time advantage, and yeah, has a solid position. After king g7, you can see that rook threatens to come across, connect with its brother over here, and start to hassle the king. So now Carlsen is under pressure. g5 played, and now it goes wrong. Here he still had a chance with rook g4. Instead he played pawn takes bishop, a reflex move, and rook g4 is a kind of a tricky move. You don't sort of plan to go in for that. And Nakamura played rook h8, and you can see white's king is getting shot by both sides. And white is so tied up here. You know, that pin is unpleasant. The king has to step up. But now simply rook h3 check. And the pawn on e3 drops. Now black is winning. The bishop is hassled. The king is in a bit of trouble as well. So the bishop has to come here and keep, you know, a sort of some kind of fortress position. But you can see it's that pawn on d4 which is weak. And black can get to it very easily. And you can see how passive that rook is. And that pawn is just dropping. So Carlsen decided to give it up. So now pawns are level and Nakamura is still the exchange up. But white still has to be very careful with his pieces because the king is in very tight situation at the edge of the board. Rook e3, that's another pawn that's dropping. I mean, this is so unpleasant for Carlsen to play. I think Nakamura in total control now. Rook b4, and now that pawn threatens just to plod down the board, and white can do very little about it. If bishop takes pawn, rook h3 is mate. That just shows you how hamstrung white's pieces are. Carlsen played e6. Doesn't help at all. King is still in huge trouble. King f7. King e7, no problem at all. And now rook b8. And the rook threatens to come around here and start hassling. So rook f4. And now Nakamura can even exchange rooks. Once you exchange rooks when you're the exchange up in an endgame, well, it was completely winning anyway, of course. And rook e1 was the final move of the game. White's only chance is to try to get the bishop in here, but that is a totally forlorn hope after bishop h5, rook h1, and then the king and pawn endgame is trivial. So I have to say, what a convincing victory by Hikaru Nakamura. And he went on to close out the set, 2.5, 1.5. The final two games were drawn. Complicated games, but frankly, I thought Nakamura was pretty much in control. Had tricky defense in game 4, but managed. It was a convincing victory by Hikaru Nakamura. So he takes the early lead in this best of 7 final, best of 7 sets. Early days, but I tell you, Carlsen's got to wake up. He looked a bit tired today. He was playing slower. Hikaru was playing with real conviction and confidence. And yeah, at the moment, he's looking good. So I'll be reporting more on this grand final coming soon. So look out for those. Thanks for watching.